to our October 2023 webinar featuring Muslim resources for supporting military personnel affected by moral injury. This webinar is part of a series that addresses the resources of each of the three religions that comprise the Abrahamic tradition. In February of 2022, three rabbis on the Soul Repair Center board introduced us to resources in Judaism useful for addressing moral injury. In this webinar, two board members who are Muslim will share the resources of their faith for responding to experiences of military moral injury. I'm Nancy Ramsay. I serve as the director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School. These webinars are a cooperative venture between Brite and the VOA Shea Center on Moral Injury, directed by Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock. Dr. Brock was the founder of the Soul Repair Center in 2012. This webinar is co-led by Ibraheem Raheem, a Muslim Army chaplain, and Amir Hussain, a scholar of Islam in America. Together, they will help participants learn new resources to aid those affected by military moral injury. We'll begin with a short introduction to Muslims in our armed forces. We'll then look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad and resources from his life that are useful for helping to understand Muslim approaches to conflict and moral injury. Participants will learn more about the Quran and themes such as self-accusing soul, expressed in the Quranic verses about Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and stories such as those about Joseph. These resources from the Islamic tradition are useful for supporting all military personnel affected by military moral injury. Dr. Hussain is professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he teaches courses on Islam, focusing on contemporary Muslim societies in North America. He is the author or editor of 5 books and over 60 scholarly articles and book chapters about religion. He was an advisor for the television series The Story of God with Morgan Freeman and appears regularly on Ancient Aliens, History's Greatest Mysteries with Lawrence Fishburne, and The Unexplained with William Shatner. In 2008, he was appointed a Fellow of the Los Angeles Institute for Humanities. He is president of the American Academy of Religion and previously served as the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. Chaplain Ibraheem, Colonel U.S. Army, DMIN, MBA, and ACPE, is the director of the School for Spiritual Care and CPE at the Graduate School, the U.S. Army Institute for Religious Leadership. Chaplain Raheem has served the Army in several roles. Initially, he served as a nurse in Germany. In 1999, he began his service as a chaplain. He has deployed in Korea, Iraq, where he did 2 tours, and Germany. Prior to his current role at the Army Institute, he was a chaplain at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. He holds a BS in Health Science, an MBA in Public Management, and an MA in Religious Practice, as well as a DMIN with emphasis in addictions in ministry. He's a member of the Association of Muslim Chaplains. Within 10 days from today, a recording of the webinar will be available on the Soul Repair Center website and the VOA's YouTube channel. I'm also grateful for the production assistance of Sam McAllister of the VOA. The first hour of our webinar will proceed with presentations by Chaplain Raheem and Professor Hussain. Toward the end of that hour, I will join them in conversation about the resources of Islam for helping persons heal from moral injury. The last 30 minutes of our webinar will be focused on the questions and comments some of you may wish to post to the chat. I will draw from those comments and questions as I pose questions to the two presenters. Please remember that a full version of this webinar will be available at the site within 10 days. You'll also find there an index to our prior webinars. Before we turn to this webinar, I wish to remind you of text from the Talmud and Quran that our center posted in response to the current violence between Israel and Hamas, also affecting Palestinians in Gaza. Both the Quran and the Talmud have this teaching. If anyone kills a person, it is as if they kill all of humanity. While if anyone saves one life, it is as if they save the lives of all humanity. We mourn the murdered, the wounded, and the missing. And now let's begin this webinar.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. As was stated earlier, I'm Chaplain Ibraheem Raheem, and I'd like to share a small presentation about how I offer ministry to Muslims with moral injury, and hopefully it'll stir some good discussion. Next slide. Okay, so as you can see here, the way I approach the subject of moral injury is a trauma to the soul. And this idea of trauma is having a wound that is not visible, but it's very important for a spiritual leader to be able to assess this problem with someone and try to help them through it. Uh, Especially in a military context, there are several conditions or environments and even events that may cause this type of trauma, leading to a moral injury. And so having some awareness of if a person has gone through those kind of things, it's helpful to begin the process of identifying this need and then finding a way to have non-threatening services available to them when they return from these deployments and combat tours and things like that. And then somewhere where they feel comfortable joining and receiving the help that they need to begin the work of working on this traumatic event that affected their soul. And again, I highlight here the distinction here of a moral injury is not what happened, but how whatever happened affected what was inside of us, meaning our spiritual center. Next slide. All right. So as we look here, these are some of the things that I think are important to recognize that trauma of the soul or moral injury might cause indicators that might arise for a person. You may hear it in the things they say or observe it in the things that they're doing. And one is an identity crisis, where a separation from who they were before the event, and they no longer identify with themselves because of it. And this is closely followed by a separation from other people and a belief that they no longer belong with the group or the people that they used to associate themselves with because of what they saw, witnessed, or took part in. This might lead to a lack of trust of other people, or trust of themselves, or some type of isolation or loneliness that you may hear them speak of. And then we can also identify some things like a distorted perception of the world. They only see negative things. They can't see anything positive going on around them. Painful memories of the event and the misery of not being able, of feeling encapsulated or imprisoned by reliving those events. Some cognitive challenges may be hard to concentrate on anything because they're always getting intrusive memories and reflecting back on what happened and kind of feeling drawn back to those times and those events instead of what's happening in front of them. Real quickly, got two more here. Overwhelmed with a personal shame. My personhood, a statement along the lines of my personhood is unworthy of any good. That's an indicator for us to pay attention to. And it's challenging to remain in the present with others. It's more easy or they're more inclined to move back into when they were in this challenging circumstance and they're stuck there. Okay, next slide. All right. So as was mentioned in the opening, a Quranic term that encapsulates some of this is this idea of a nafs el lawama, and this is the self-accusing soul. It's found in the Holy Quran, chapter 72, second verse. And this is a foundational term to understand for other caregivers what a Muslim might be going through, whether or not they're familiar with this kind of language or this term. This is an Islamic explanation of what it is that they're going through. And there are some examples in the cases of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel that describe this. And in both instances, there was a awareness of wrongdoing accompanied by guilt and shame that led to a need for forgiveness and restoration in order for their soul to return to a good standing with God. Okay, next slide. And again, a little bit more about the self-accusing soul. Again, if you break this term down, it's nafs, which means soul, and lawam to include self-incriminating, self-reproaching, blaming oneself, to be in turmoil over guilt and shame. And all of these align with this idea of moral injury, where something that was done or not done went against the person's values and beliefs. And what I guess we should also be concerned about is it just gets worse over time. The person feels more and more fixated on these problems, these ideas of guilt, shame, remorse, and feeling helpless in terms of being able to correct what was wrong. And so one of the ways that we can help is to make a pathway to working and restoring on those things that the person has the guilt and shame around. So healing for them is all about repairing and restoring their soul to regain this meaning and purpose that has been lost through the event that caused this idea of a self-accusing soul. Next slide. So here are some healing opportunities that caregivers can offer. The idea of forgiveness, some actual rituals, and other forms of restoration that we might recommend and help people work on to regain a sense of power and control over themselves and restoration in their religious or spiritual life. And this term that identifies a resurrected or restored soul is mentioned in the Quran, chapter 89, verses 27 and 28. And the term there is mutma, and here meaning a soul that has reached a state of serenity and is now at peace. And this comes from the work that they've done to heal and restore themselves. And here I just have a few things that I have used with soldiers, sailors, and airmen to work on these things. We've practiced what is called itikaf, which is a seclusion in a masjid for a few days. It's pretty much cut off all connection to all other people in society, and it's just focused on prayers of forgiveness, and also fasting and reading of scripture and studying the prophet's life and things like that for a considerable amount of days, to where the person has been able to remove themselves from a lot of interaction with other people and to focus on themselves. And during that time, seeking forgiveness from God, and that might include also some fasting. It also may include rituals of release, which can be done with writing down one's transgressions on paper and making a commitment to move past that by throwing that into the fire or into a water source, and to release that bad action or place of regret in those ways to move away from them. And finally, to make restoration, to go back and uh, apologize, pay compensation for a loss, repair something that is broken in any way possible to make right what was once in their mind broken. And I believe that's the last resource I have here, and I will open it up for the next presentation. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. It's morning here, still in California. Good afternoon for those of you who are on the East Coast. Thanks, Ibraheem, for that marvelous presentation. As Nancy said, my name's Amir Hussain. I teach here at Loyola Marymount University. I do work with the Navy, so I had to make sure to represent here. But as a Muslim who's a scholar of Islam, I'm delighted to be part of this. Nancy mentioned that I am the current president of the American Academy of Religion, and at the American Academy of Religion annual meeting, which will be in November in San Antonio, one of the plenary sessions that I put together is a film called Three Chaplains, which sort of looks at Muslim chaplains in the military. And then we'll have a panel discussion with the chaplains, with David Washburn, the filmmaker, and with a couple other folks around that. And so this is something that's really important for me. I want to thank Nancy for having me be part of this, and it's great to have Rita here. I came into this work, as many of us did, through Rita and the soul repair work, and the work that she's doing now at the Shea Center is just marvelous. And Ibraheem talked about moral injury and the work there. And for those that aren't familiar with this, Jonathan Shea's work is extraordinary, particularly the Achilles in Vietnam book and the role that epic and myth sort of play in this. And I think that's really important. And that's where I want to not start, but I will talk a little bit about the resources for Islam based on the Prophet Muhammad. But just in terms of a little bit of background and history, Islam has this very long history in America that most of us aren't aware of. 1528, so coming up on 500 years, you have the first documented Muslim slave, Estevanico the Moor. If those of you who are in Texas or spend time in Texas, at the State House in Austin, there's a sculpture for the Texas African American History Memorial, and there's an image of Estevanico the Moor as the first person of African heritage to set foot in Texas. So this is really interesting. Like, he's literally memorialized in Austin at the State House there. But it's been 500 years since you've had Muslims who were brought here first as slaves. Estevanico was brought as a slave of one of the conquistadors from Spain. You've had Muslims that have been involved in the military. It's not a huge number. We don't have exact numbers, but there's somewhere close to 6,000 at least Muslims in the military. And I'll defer to Ibraheem, as a Muslim in the military, to talk a little bit more about that when we have our discussion about the Muslims working in the military. But for you who are chaplains, of course, what are resources that you may be able to bring? And for Muslims, if you know about Islam, you know the importance of the Prophet Muhammad for Muslims. And his life is the exemplary life. How are you supposed to live out your life as a Muslim? Well, you follow the example of the Prophet. And so there are great biographies of the Prophet. I'm an academic, so my show and tell is not interesting. It's books. Martin Lings's book, Muhammad, His Life Based on the Earliest Sources. It's a great text, and it's sort of like traditional biography that's written by someone who's a British Muslim. And so it reads in the way that if you were to read a traditional Arabic biography, this book would be great. But lots of them. This is an older version. Karen Armstrong has a new version of this. So many of you know Karen Armstrong, Muhammad, a prophet for our time. Karen's done just great work there. And so that life is crucial for Muslims. The idea that you follow the example of the Prophet. Well, the Prophet's life is this life, this heroic kind of life. And I'm making that equation with the thing that I just mentioned, Jonathan Shea's great work, Achilles in Vietnam, about sort of epic and biography and where this comes in. Because this is the life of the Prophet. This is a person who's born into a society that's tribal and polytheistic. His father dies before he's born. His mother dies when he's 6. He's raised by his grandfather who dies when the boy is 8. So this is someone who experiences loss and trauma. He gets the first revelations when he's 40 years old. He begins to preach, but doesn't meet with great success because the message that he's preaching is in opposition to the society around him, which is polytheistic. He's preaching the monotheism, the one God, but also an ethical monotheism. You have to treat each other appropriately because you're all children of that one God. I'm not surprised this doesn't go well. He gets persecuted for his beliefs. He literally has to go to war. And so that's one of these important kinds of things that in the life of the prophet, you have warfare. You have the prophet engaging in warfare for survival. And we can, in our discussion, talk a little bit more about that. So I think for Muslims, this becomes really crucial. The text in the Quran that I think is particularly relevant is the 12th chapter of the Quran, the chapter of Joseph. It's the longest sustained narrative in the Quran. It's the story that's told, as it's told in the Bible, of Joseph, the son of Jacob, who's sold into slavery by his brothers. And so if you look at moral injury, what's a better example than this? Someone who's done nothing wrong, who then gets put into these kinds of situations. That story is told in the Quran. It's revealed to the prophet without getting into the sort of technicalities of Islamic history or prophetic history. It's revealed to the prophet at a time after his wife dies in the year 619, after his uncle dies a few months later. The uncle is the one that raised him after his grandfather died. And so that's really this important moment. It's this low point in the prophet's life. His wife, who's been married to for almost 25 years, has died. His uncle, who's been sort of the father figure protector, has died. He approaches people in a neighboring town. He's in Mecca at this point in Taif, assuming that they will help him. And not only do they not help him, they persecute him. It's at this moment that this chapter is revealed to the prophet, the chapter of Joseph, and it tells the story of Joseph, sort of sold into slavery by his brothers, who then is able to overcome the sort of obstacles and is there in a position of power and authority over his brothers, forgives them. This is something, without getting into that, this is something that the prophet uses later on in his life when he forgives the people that persecuted him. But I think that story is sort of a great resource, as is the life of the Prophet Muhammad for Muslims. So I think those are the kinds of things that I'd like to, get us talking a little bit more about, just a little bit about the history and the fact that we've had Muslims in this country for coming on 500 years, the Muslims in the military, but then some of those particular resources, from the experience of the prophet, from the revelation of the Quran, particularly this one chapter. And I really appreciated what Ibraheem had around the more particular kinds of resources there. So let me stop here, and then I think we can throw it open. I think Nancy and I and Ibraheem for some more conversation here.
Sam, thanks for joining us together. And I at this point, I simply want to invite the two of you to begin, going back and forth about the connections in what you said and the ways it prompts further ideas, especially, I think, as you're suggesting, Amir, and Amir, you're muted at the moment, how the Ibraheem, if you could start with your own work as a chaplain, how you have found the sources of Islam to be responsive to the various and sometimes quite challenging ways that moral injury affects persons in the military.
Oh, thank you, Nancy. Well, first of all, the resources that Amir presented are excellent. Those are some of my most favorite books that he put forth today, and they're easy reads, but they give you just great insight in terms of understanding the way the prophet lived. And there's so many things that are relatable to today that are captured in those two works. So thank you again, Amir, for that. Um, uh, as a chaplain, people come, as long as we are inviting and create a non-threatening environment, people come to us with things that they probably won't come to anyone else with. And so trying to maintain the sacredness of that relationship, um, a lot of it is just being available and willing to hear what is being offered and not judging a person uh, for whatever they're trying to work through. So I like to start there with people. It's just a non-judgmental, safe environment for them to bring what it is that's troubling them. And then from there, a lot of these other uh, resources I try to help them move into, which can be difficult at times because people are really non-trusting with this type of sensitive and very difficult information.
I'm just jumping in there. I think that the other part, and thank you for that, Ibrahim, that's marvelous, is that, when you're looking particularly at Muslims in the armed forces, like it's a small number. It's not an insignificant number. It's at least 6,000 of us that are in the armed forces. But then you look at the kind of complications of that because, we're still connected. We talked at the opening about the war going on with Israel and Gaza, and the way in which sort of Muslims are sometimes portrayed as being, terrorist, violent. The wars that we're engaged in Afghanistan and Iraq. What I mean by that is, for Muslims in the military, there are often these kinds of issues, both because they're in a minority group, both because the sort of general perception of Islam and Muslims, I'm smiling, is not particularly a positive one, not within the military uniquely, but within America, let's say. And so you're dealing with those kinds of issues to begin with, and so I can't imagine the kind of work that needs to go into to work with Muslim service people. So thanks again, Ibrahim, for your work there. And I think that's important to discuss. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in what do you do as chaplains with the majority of your service people who aren't Muslim? Only but 6,000-7,000 or so are Muslim. What do you do with the ones that aren't Muslim, and the kind of negative attitudes that I think they might have? And so I think that's important as well. And so to have those kinds of understandings and awareness of, oh, here's the sort of basics of Islam. Here's the sort of things around the life of the Prophet that Nancy mentioned my work with Morgan Freeman on the story of God with Morgan Freeman. And for those that aren't familiar with that, shameless plug for that, 3 seasons, marvelous kind of thing that Mr. Freeman did. But it was a learning experience for him that he tells his story because someone asked him once, how'd you come to do this? And you'll see where I'm going with this in a minute. Well, he's a very, very smart guy, travels a lot when he does his filming in other places. He was in Turkey filming something. I think it was one of the Chris Nolan Batman films. He plays the Lucius Fox character there. And on a day off from shooting, he gets a tour of Hagia Sophia, and that shows Mr. Freeman, like, he's not just sort of sitting in his trailer. He's like, oh, I'm in Turkey. Let me look at the historical places. Let me look at this great historical site. And when you're Morgan Freeman, you get a private tour, and they show him this marvelous mosaic in the ceiling that some of you may have seen. It's a Byzantine mosaic of Jesus and Mary. And he says, no, wait a minute. You told me that this was built by the Byzantines. It was built as an Orthodox church. Yes. Okay, I understand the Byzantines have icons. I understand why they have this icon. But then you said, this was captured by the Muslims. And then, this city that had been Constantinople became Istanbul. And this place that was a Byzantine church became a mosque. Yes. Well, why would the Muslims leave an image of Jesus and Mary? And the tour guide looked at him and said, well, Mr. Freeman, Jesus and Mary are important to Muslims. And he just paused and said, oh, I did not know that. I didn't know that Jesus and Mary were important to Muslims. And if this is a basic point about Islam, what else don't I know about Islam? What else do I know about religion? I use that story as a way of talking about, here's this brilliant guy, amazing actor, doesn't know much about Islam. he can go off and do a TV show to teach him about Islam, about religion. But I think that that's part of it. I'm speaking out of you as the chaplains here are in this extraordinary position to be able to help and educate, the people that you're serving. Not, I don't mean to say not just as a way of diminishing it, not only in terms of the work you're doing here, but just that those basic kinds of things about Islam, about Muslims, then being able to perhaps even bring in some of those resources like that story that I mentioned, the Joseph chapter, chapter 12 of the Quran.
Ibraheem, I think that's a great idea, and as you can see, there are others that are with us on this webinar who would be helped if you could show how you, as a Muslim chaplain, or how any chaplain, that's more to the point, could respond to a Muslim service person who is experiencing forms of moral injury or other difficulties. And then we could have a separate conversation, which is also important, of how you would advise chaplains of other faiths to be mindful of the resources of Islam. But let's start first with the question that one of our participants has asked about how do the materials that each of you has mentioned inform care with active duty or reservists or retired members of the military that are dealing with challenging memories, for example. Could you use some illustrations from your own chaplaincy and those of others whom you know?
So that was a lot, Nancy.
Yeah, it is, but we've got
so
time.
The challenge. So if we approach with the non-judgmental, non-threatening environment, and we have some awareness that this person is struggling with something that happened that put a major strain on their spirituality, their soul, then we can see how that they probably have been yearning for someone to be able to do that kind of work with them. And so first we set that condition. We make it very easy for them to come to us and feel safe. I think if we don't do anything else, we create a safe environment and they can share with us their problems and issues. We've begun a really important process for them to realize that, oh, there's somewhere I can go that somebody understands, and they're not going to judge me. They're not going to beat me over the head with my faith and tell me how bad of a Muslim I am. But they're going to try to help me get to a place of restoration. And one of the things that Amir said that I think, which is sort of one of the first things I said to recognize, is this identity crisis that might be from the traumatic event, but it also might be, as he pointed out, the fact that they are trying to coexist in a society in an environment that is not always easy to coexist in, right? The assumption is a lot of times that you're something about you isn't quite like everyone else because you're a Muslim. And so you have to work really hard to save face and work really hard to prove yourself. And so there's this constant struggle with your own identity, fitting in and belonging, because people are scrutinizing you a little bit different than everyone else. And until you, I guess, dispel some of those things. So identity crisis is something that you can quickly start to know that there's probably going to be something there, and also an inviting, safe, non-judgmental environment. I think those two things for any chaplain caregiver, they can help just about any Muslim.
Mm-hmm. If some folks may not be aware of the small number of Muslim and Jewish chaplains in the military, and the responsibility that then that smaller group has for being a subject matter expert, that you probably serve in that role. So if a Christian, maybe Protestant chaplain is working with a Muslim soldier, in your case, that person, could you talk about the system that assures consultation? Similarly, if you were working with a Christian, that you could consult. Could you inform folks a bit about that?
Uh, I, I think, are you referring to the idea of confidentiality?
No, I'm talking about the
That's
ways
a
in which
position.
I'm talking, that is important, confidentiality is important, but I'm talking about the ways in which the military attempts to assure that even um, the smaller number, let's say, of Jewish uh, enlisted persons or officers and Muslim enlisted persons or officers, um, where there are fewer number of Muslim chaplains or Jewish rabbis who are chaplains, that that personnel who identify with that religion can, the chaplains can be assisted to be effective with them. So that chaplains that are subject matter experts, I guess you could say. I think it might be helpful for persons to know that that's part of how the military tries to assure that um, that persons who identify as Muslim, for example, will receive informed care.
Okay, yeah. So one of the ways that the military is unique is that you begin your career uh, with, you know, several chaplains of different faiths, and then you get to know each other early in your career, and then those relationships are maintained throughout your career, and so you can always uh, consult the different uh, unique faith groups and different faith groups when you have a particular service member who has a religious need, and you don't know, you're not just SME or subject matter expert for them, but you know someone who is. And so if my experience is, I've maintained relationships with everyone in my original class, as well as throughout my different assignments. And so as they need me for different specific Muslim service member needs, I'm there for them, and likewise in cases where, even though I can offer basic care and concern for people, there may be a specific religious need that I may call on them to help me provide for that service member.
Yes, and so if it, like, you would know if you were dealing with a person of another religious tradition, you weren't sure about some resources for that person, you have a network of persons on whom you can call. And I think that's an important
Yes.
thing. Not everyone knows who is not part of the military. Um, how how does there's a question in the chat that I think is a quite relevant one. Could either of you or both of you talk about some of the resources in Islam that would help inform a response to a person who likely might either feel a need of deep forgiveness or a process? Let's start there and also then talk about how that person might forgive or come to terms with what another in the military did to them. Um, since that can also, a betrayal of trust within the military can also happen. But let's start first with a person who is struggling with a need of forgiveness. Perhaps this is a conflict veteran, and this person is, he or she is wrestling with, they are wrestling with a struggle to be forgiven, to feel forgiven.
Let me jump in
Sure.
on that here. So just a couple of things. One is just in terms of the background. I didn't mention this book, Edward Curtis's book, Muslim Americans in the Military. It's a little book that came out of Indiana University Press. Edward teaches at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. A great sort of look at, just some of the history there. So I think that's important. But the question, I'm just looking at it in the chat about forgiveness, repentance, and it's so important. that this is one of the things that's crucial to being a Muslim. We just finished a couple of weeks ago the Jewish High Holy Days, and I was privileged to be at the Rosh Hashanah services with my rabbi here, Sharon Brous, who's this amazing Rabbi Eddie Carr. I didn't go on Yom Kippur because I didn't want to fast, the day there. But the idea that in the Jewish tradition, what's the most important day? Well, Yom Kippur, which is a day of repentance, asking for forgiveness, fasting, doing that. Muslims have the same kind of thing. The month of Ramadan isn't about fasting in that same kind of way, but certainly that notion of you're abstaining from eating, you're thinking about these kinds of experiences here, and you're asking for forgiveness. The central ritual for Muslims at the Hajj, the pilgrimage rituals, is literally the day you spend at Arafat. Arafat's sort of a hill outside of Mecca, where it's basically like a dress rehearsal for the day of resurrection. The pilgrims are there; they spend the day in prayer, in asking God's forgiveness, asking the repentance. When you pray, you are routinely asking for forgiveness. If you've seen Muslims pray at the point when we're on our knees and we touch our head to the ground and we're praising God, when you come up, the phrase that you're saying is, "Oh my Lord, forgive me," asking God's forgiveness. So literally, every single time that Muslims pray, in the physical act of prayer, they're asking for forgiveness. And so this idea that the forgiveness from God is really crucial and central, and all of us need it, some of us more than others, some of us at more times than others. And so asking for God's forgiveness, but then being able to forgive other people. And that's where I made the links with Yom Kippur, that it's not just about us asking God's forgiveness, it's us forgiving people for things that they've done to us. It's us asking for forgiveness from people for the things that we have done to them. So those kinds of things become really, really important. And the Quran often talks about the same kind of legal sorts of things the Hebrew Bible says, for this, here's the punishment, or here's the penalty, or here's the consequence. But it often says, but forgiveness is better. That, yes, you have the right to this, but if you can forgive that person, it's actually a better kind of thing. That's the hard stuff. It's a hard thing to do. All of us know, I think, how difficult that is. And so I think, again, those kinds of ideas, without going into Ibraheem's territory, because I'm not a chaplain, but exactly that notion of sin, Muslims have that same idea, again, using the Hebrew, that it literally, means to miss the mark. We're not perfect. We don't do all the right things. We make mistakes. And so we ask God for forgiveness. We talk with God. It's important to do that. And Ibraheem can talk about the sort of rituals, whether it's prayer. I love some of the ways in which he was describing the work that you do there with people in the military about, how do you forgive someone? How do you do this kind of work? And, specific kinds of prayers, specific kinds of things with respect to fasting. I think that's really, really crucial, but it's work, and it's hard work.
Yeah, you pretty much covered everything there, Amir. Thank you. I would just add to his great insight there that if you look at forgiveness as a form, it's really a language of economics, whereas there's debt. Now, someone owes you something, or you owe someone something because of something that was said or done. And if you look at it in that lens, when you don't forgive, you're robbing your own soul of being free from that weight of debt to someone else. So this idea of releasing debt is saying someone owes me something, but I'm going to forego it because that's better for my soul, and it's also going to help them recover from the feeling of indebtedness to me. And so this is a very strong a way to either free your soul or burden your soul. When you haven't forgiven or you haven't asked for forgiveness and settled your score with God, or you haven't forgave someone else. So forgiveness is really at the core of a lot of that, because and to me the biggest one is self-forgiveness. Can I forgive myself for something that I've done that was, outside of my beliefs and values?
Yeah, that just so Nancy, just to say one more thing about that, I think the other part of that, I think, is this idea for Muslims that God is merciful, that God is forgiving. Oftentimes people standing on the outside sort of look at this and think of, the sort of caricature and uh, forgive that analogy. Oftentimes, sometimes Christians might talk about, the God of the Old Testament is this God of vengeance, and it's that same kind of idea. The God of the Quran is this God of violence and vengeance. It's not this loving God. It's like, that's not how Jews understand. I've got a lot of Jewish friends, the way in which they understand God is not that. The way in which Muslims understand God is not that this is a loving, forgiving, merciful God. You may have heard the phrase, the 99 names of God. The Quran talks about the most beautiful names. The Quran says, to God belong the most beautiful names, so call upon God by them. The most common of those names is Rahman, the merciful, Raheem, the compassionate. All but one of the chapters of the Quran begin with this phrase, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, literally in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, the specifically merciful, the generally merciful, but this idea of the mercy of God. And so that humans are humans. They're fallible. They make mistakes. God is God. God forgives. God has mercy. And it's the same kind of thing that you see in other traditions of, in the same way that God shows mercy to us, we're expected to show mercy and forgiveness to other people. But the hard part is, how do you do it to yourself? How do you forgive yourself? What are the ways in which you can do that? And that's what takes the work. And that's where, again, my hat's off to all of you, who are chaplains who help people with exactly that kind of really difficult work.
Ibraheem, could you talk about, you can fictionalize this, of course, but um, drawing on your experience, if you were working with a combat veteran, might not be retired yet or out of the military, but was in some of the heavily conflictual contexts that you yourself, in which you yourself have served, um, and might be struggling with either what that person saw, you know, happen between, it might be something, we certainly have persons who are veterans that had to shoot at a car approaching and then discovered that bullet killed a child in the back seat. They were seeking protection. Or it could be, throwing a grenade in Iraq to protect troops in a truck, and you thought it was a grenade, but it was a rock. So a child was killed that was throwing it. In other words, war includes great vulnerability to to morally injurious experiences that could mean I violated my deepest conscience in attempting, but in the process of war. How would you draw on the resources of Islam for someone struggling with coming to terms with what, in the context of war, they were ordered to do or felt they had to do, either protect themselves or those beside them?
Yeah. So one of the sayings that Muslims kind of refer back to often is, God knows our intentions. And so, in the context of war, and we truly were trying to defend ourselves, protect ourselves, you know, uh, do something that was um, intended to fight the enemy, but then it turns out that was something else that happened, right? Uh, God already knew what your intentions were, but the context of war sometimes gets gets foggy. Sometimes it gets confusing. Sometimes, accidents and mistakes happen. And so, again, it depends on how the individual can move to a place of self-forgiveness for that, because maybe they have children and a child was killed, and it's hard for them to overcome this idea of killing a child because they're a parent themselves, and in their mind, it's the most sacred thing to a parent is their child. And so they can't forgive, they can't move to this place. So helping them get to a place to move to a place of self-forgiveness is really, I share that verse that says, God knows your intentions. And if you didn't mean to do it, it was a mistake. And you go back and you do your best to repair for the wrong you did and apologize for the wrong you did. God forgives all, as Amir pointed out earlier.
Are there ritual processes that I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had more to say. Excuse me.
No, I just want to make sure I answered your question.
You did, and I'm following up with another one. In addition to sharing those words, which would be helpful, the pain likely will linger, not be lifted entirely, is simply in the hearing. Are there ritual practices, as there are in the other two traditions, that that you might also suggest for helping that person kind of live into the truth of what you have shared about the forgiving, the being able to rely on God's forgiving them? What ritual processes might you turn to in your tradition?
Yeah, so earlier I spoke about the whole idea of releasing rituals, where you commit to identifying something that you want to be forgiven for, and you ask for forgiveness, and you write this on some paper or something perishable, and then you put it in the fire or you put it in the water source, and it goes away. And so that is one that's been working a great deal for a lot of combat veterans to move out of that stuckness of being there, still reliving this over and over again, to start seeing themselves, seeing the future again and moving on with their lives. But another particular ritual that I add with that is we have two forms of washing. One is the ritual of ablution for prayers, and we call the ghusl, or the total body washing. And I always invite them to do both the ritual of cleansing before they do this releasing exercise, and then the ghusl, or the full body wash after, symbolically rinsing themselves and cleaning themselves from that event.
Let me just follow up on that, Ibraheem, and thank you for that, because that's a marvelous kind of thing. That what I would have said here is that, how do we help people, meaning in this case Muslims, to sort of understand their own ritual tradition, which often they may have been disconnected from. And so if we look at fasting, for example, most of my Muslim friends may fast during the month of Ramadan, but that's kind of it. And you want to say, well, there are other fast days. There's fasting on Ashura. The Prophet would fast 2 days a week, this kind of thing. And so what's it like to sort of incorporate those things, or the prayers that, in the Sunni tradition, it's obligatory for men to pray the Friday afternoon prayer in congregation. But if you can pray the other prayers in congregation, that helps too. And I think this goes exactly to what Ibraheem was talking about. What's it like to prepare for prayer? Just the ablutions. And I say that for me, sitting here in my office, walking to the bathroom when it's time to pray, and just let me take a minute. Let me you wash my hands, wash my face. Do the kinds of things there. Come back, lay out the sort of prayer mat that I've got wrapped up there. That kind of thing. But I'm doing that by myself in my room with the door closed? What's it like with colleagues? What's this like in community? And again, to show that it's not just you isolated individual, it's you collective. And so to say, well, what would we like to pray, not just the Jummah, the Friday afternoon prayer community, but maybe the other prayers in community? Fajr, the dawn prayer, maybe not so much because, you're at home and you can't drive to the mosque, but maybe the afternoon prayer, are there people there? Can you pray this together? And so I think for me, it's that sense of that collective, or with the fasting, almost as this sort of expiation kind of ritual. Sure. What's it like? Like if you've done something that, you think is really horrible traditionally, okay, well, a fast day. If you've got the economic resources, the giving to charity, doing that kind of thing. But I think that sense of saying you're not alone in this, and what better way of saying you're not alone in this than literally having people stand, because you've seen the Muslim prayer. It's literally standing shoulder to shoulder. You're literally standing shoulder to shoulder with the other person, whether it's one person or 5,000 people. And so I think in some ways that kind of connection helps, because as much as I can say, look, God forgives you, God has told you in the Quran that God will forgive you. You will find that out on the day of judgment when you encounter God. Whether you forgive yourself or not is up to you, but know that God forgives you. But I think sometimes having that sense of community, that we're not, shunned by people, that we're not excluded from the community, that, when we do the kind of communal prayer here at my university, we have a dedicated prayer space. We do the Friday afternoon prayers in community. There's no one standing there saying, well, wait a minute, who's coming in here? Have you washed? Have you done this? Are you pure? Are you clean? Is your heart, it's like, that's not up to me. That's up to God. We welcome you. You want to come pray with us? Welcome to come pray with us. But I think it's that sense of the community there, which I think is crucial.
Yeah, and real quick, Nancy, as Amir was talking, I just thought of one more thing. This idea of being forgiven in God's mercy. The truth is, none of us are deserving of paradise. We've all fallen short, and so somehow believing that I've earned my way in is a flawed way of thinking anyway. The truth is we need forgiveness to be humbled, to realize that none of us really have on our own merits can make it. We need that mercy from each other. We need that mercy from God to even get there.
Good enough. In chaplaincy school, Ibraheem, are there how do the armed forces help you and your colleagues, at least in the other two Abrahamic traditions, become more aware of the resources in each other's traditions?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes, in the chaplaincy, how does the military help the chaplains in the several traditions in which they're trained become more aware of the resources and the kinds of connections that you've been lifting up? Is this a part of chaplaincy education? And that's my first question. That's my first part of the question. How are chaplains in the three traditions, how do they become more aware of what they can borrow, for example?
Yeah, so Amir kind of touched on it. You develop friendships, and those friends invite you to services, invite you to celebrations and religious events, and you learn by through those friendships, and you learn through those working together. Say, for instance, when I was in a battalion, I was a captain. I had two other battalions that were other captains, and we always needed each other for something. If one person had to take leave or one person was deployed or whatever, we would lean on each other to help cover their people. And so when you start working together, and this is true for civilian chaplaincy too, you start working together, you start developing friendships, you start learning about the other person's faith and the individuals that practice those faiths and all the different nuances that come with that, as opposed to, for instance, as Amir stated earlier, not even realizing that, oh, you guys have a high regard for Mary and Jesus too. I didn't know that. But you learn that in those friendships and as you attend different services and different religious activities.
So it's not built into any curricular or ongoing education practice. It's relying on informal strategies at the moment.
Well, there are classes that you can learn about a little bit about, but the problem with those are uh, it's easier to show you than to tell you because some things just are lost in the didactic format. That okay, if you tell me okay, this is what Muslims do on Friday, it's just words on the screen until you actually go there and you participate in the service. You say, oh, when you said this is what that looks like actually in real life. And then you can ask questions and say, well, when this happened, what was going on there? And then you really get a good understanding of it. So yes, there are some classes that you learn about the various faith groups, but until you visit the service, you don't really know.
Well, I'm thinking about you leading an ACPE program really for chaplains. And in that case, you walk into a hospital room not knowing where you might have it on the chart, what a person's tradition is, but you're the chaplain on that floor. In what case and how in the program that's related to ACPE competencies, how do chaplains become at least familiar with the different strategies for caring for a person who may identify in a tradition other than their own?
Did you say how? How
Yes.
does that
How
actually
did,
happen?
yeah, huh?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So I think that what we teach in clinical pastoral education is that it's not about us. It's about the needs of the patient or the person you're serving.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so a good chaplain is going to assess for those needs. And if they're beyond the scope of what they can offer in general care, they're going to go uh, get a consult for that particular faith chaplain to come by and offer that.
Mhm. Or they'll call that subject matter expert if there's no nearby chaplain, I assume.
Yes, and so if there's not one on staff, they would either have a contract with that particular
Mhm.
faith, or they would have resources outside of the hospital that they would contact to come in to offer that service.
Mhm.
Just if I could just add to that, I think the crucial thing, and Ibraheem mentioned this as well, is it's not even so much about reading or learning. It's about the personal connection. Like you want to learn about Islam, you want to learn about Judaism, make a Jewish friend. I can give you 2 books to read on Judaism, but if you go to a Jewish house for Shabbat dinner, you learn a whole lot more than any book there. And just those moments. Like I remember the first time going to a Rosh Hashanah service, and in my head I sort of knew what this was, but until you're actually there, you don't know what it's like. And there's a moment where you're prostrate. You literally bow down as a Jew, and you bow down, and people sort of find a spot in the synagogue and literally touch their heads. I'm like, I had no idea you did this. Or Orthodox friends, meaning Orthodox Christian friends, not Orthodox Jewish friends, talking about the Lenten services, and there's a moment if you're Orthodox during Lent where you literally like each day prostrate yourself. And so there's this notion that, when Muslims bow down and pray and touch the ground, that's not something we invented. Jews and Christians were doing this long before Islam came into the world. But until you're actually in that situation where your Orthodox friend takes you to a service or your Jewish friend, brings you to her home for Shabbat dinner to have that, I think that's really important in those kinds of learnings. Someone had asked about the film that I mentioned, the Three Chaplains, and that's a new film that David Washburn has done. There's a couple of places that are sort of screening it. It should be, my understanding from David, who's the filmmaker, is that it should be airing on PBS, I think on Veterans Day. And so that'll be important to look at. And that just looks at some of the particular issues with respect to 3 Muslim chaplains, within the armed forces, but sort of look for that on PBS, around Veterans Day, and then there'll be some programming. And I think there's some other places. Nancy, you'd sent us something about a screening of that.
Right. The Chaplaincy Innovation Lab is also, we're advertising that. The center is advertising that. But you do need to get a link, you reserve a place. But your point is, I think, that there are ways to better acquaint oneself.
Absolutely. And I think that's like, so for me with, my professional association that you mentioned, the American Academy of Religion, because we're meeting in San Antonio, because, San Antonio is a military town, one of the things that I wanted to do, and just because of my own interests, with the folks doing Muslim chaplaincy, even though that's not something I do, I think it's crucial that what we're doing, like that panel will be on the Saturday of the American Academy of Religion meetings in November. And we're doing it at a hotel to have, and to have it open to the community so folks can come. We'll bring the three chaplains are in the film to the screening and have a sort of a Q&A with them. But I think for me, that's part of, what can I do in my own little way to help? Well, if you happen to be in San Antonio, come to this event and watch this film and hear these chaplains talk about the kind of work that they do. And again, that awareness that, so much of that it's the same thing that I do. Like, I teach a university with 6,000 students, of which maybe 250 are Muslims. So, am I working with the 250 Muslim students, or am I working with the 5,800 non-Muslims? Well, of course, I'm working with both, and I'm a humanities guy, but I know 5,800 is a little bigger than 250. And so, what's the kind of work that we're doing? How are we helping out here?
I'm wondering, if for you, Ibraheem, are there ways that now, especially in the position you're in, that you can imagine the services can help, can facilitate wider understanding among the chaplaincy corps of the resources of the several traditions? And if so, what might work besides the kind of informal strategies? Because I'm imagining that there's some locations where there's probably a Christian chaplain, but there may not be a rabbi or an imam or a Muslim chaplain.
Yeah, so a lot of my time and energy is invested into the training programs that we have in clinical pastoral education and moral injury and trauma ministry. And so a lot happens in those contexts where, because I'm from the Islamic faith, I can share my experiences. I can share my faith. I can share I may be, for instance, going through a Ramadan, and I can share some of that or invite people to that. So a lot of sharing those resources happens when you have multiple faiths working together in a cohort doing a course to share their backgrounds and invite each other to their various services and those kind of things. So those are some of the ways that I've been a part of those opportunities throughout the years, training environments, and also just permanent assignments where, again, I've become friends with various different faith groups, and their families have invited me to their homes or invited me to some of their major religious events. And that's when a lot of learning happens. And we tend to invite as many people who are interested in coming to those events so that people can start to ask questions, learn more about what was happening, what is this ritual or service about, and how does it relate to the faith and things like that.
So you, in a way, you're describing you look for the openings, and as you're preparing persons for contexts of a hospital care, for example, there's strategies for that kind of teaching to go on. with the person that's directing that program there and helping folks to listen to or advise for how to respond to that patient. I mean, there's it's consultative across the experience, it sounds as if. And I, I, I'm wondering that there's a question that's just come up about, um, you know, we know that moral injury is shame-based. That is, I failed to be who I intended to be. There's a question here about responding to post-traumatic stress. That is where I was terrified that I was in mortal danger, and the kind of anxiety that comes with that. So there's a question about if you are dealing with a person who's less responding to moral injury than to post-traumatic stress, that I was in peril. What would be the resources that you might turn to, Ibraheem or Amir, for responding to that situation?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. And what I will say is the more we learn about moral injury, the more we realize that sometimes they get confused and or neglected. Moral injuries get neglected and fall under PTSD when maybe it was all along a moral injury to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, but that said, PTSD is strictly a diagnosis, and therefore, an actual physician with that background will be helping that person, as opposed to moral injury is more of a spiritual uh, phenomenon, and so most of the time that falls back on chaplain to help people get through it.
Yeah. Okay. I can think a person might reflect with a chaplain about that profound sense of precarity, that death was that close, um, that I was in, that life passed, my life seemed to pass by quickly in my vision. So I can see how a person might still want to talk with the chaplain, but I do understand the difference between the two, that of diagnosis. So let me, if you two had hopes for the ways in which the chaplaincy could continue to develop what you're describing as happening informally, Ibraheem in particular, what would be the benefit for chaplains, at least of the three Abrahamic traditions, if there were opportunities for conversation or shared reflection about those resources in relation to predictable conversations, either on a base or on a battlefield or in a hospital?
So, what was the initial part of the question? I got caught the end of it.
Okay. And I'll say, let me try it again. What would be some strategies and benefits if chaplains who identify with each of these several traditions were able to talk together about the resources that they would bring to some of these, I don't want to say common in the sense of unimportant, but predictable ways that persons of these traditions might seek out a chaplain because they're troubled. In other words, if there were more conversation between you all.
Yeah, so the benefits would be astronomical. I mean, I think we collectively could do greater work with those who need that kind of help because we had that kind of a ongoing dialogue. We would be learning a lot more about each other's space and getting, I guess, crime for and being able to refer back to someone who was, very good at understanding that. For instance, Amir shared a lot of interactions with Jewish rabbis, and I'm sure he's grown tremendously in terms of his understanding of it. But he also has a relationship with a rabbi that if it's over his head, he can just quickly make contact with that rabbi, and then now that person is in touch with who they need to be in touch with. I think that's one of the great benefits of having that kind of a dialogue ongoing.
And just in learning from each other, I think that there's a question in the chat about Ibrahim mentioned itikaf. That process literally means like staying in place. So uh, people who are particularly sort of pious observant during Ramadan will sort of in the last 10 days of the month, go to the mosque and literally spend the day, I mean, days and nights in the mosque. And so it's like a retreat, and so I think that goes to the point of what do you learn from folks, when I became department chair of my department, I approached one of the Jesuits who I'd known for 15 years, said, okay, I've talked to you for 15 years about wanting to do the Jesuit spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. I need to do it now because now I'm going to become department chair and I need a place to put the stuff of when I hear the things about my colleagues that I shouldn't hear about them, because as a colleague, you can assume that everyone does marvelous things, but as chair, you're now in a position of responsibility. And so we did what the Jesuits call the 19th annotation. Typically when Ignatius did it, it was a 30-day retreat. My wife's not going to let me go away for 30 days, and most of us aren't able to go away for 30 days and, make a retreat. And so how do you do this? Well, you do this in these really interesting ways, and sort of working with the Jesuit priest here, and the first one to say, "Look, I'm not directing this. God is directing this. I'm just helping out here." And so I love that kind of connection. But exactly that moment of because you have this connection, because you have this friendship, because you're able to do this practice, that this is really interesting because my prayer life is sort of this kind of ritualized prayer life. I've really haven't been doing the other kinds of things. What's it like to do it from this perspective? And I think that was really powerful for me. And so I think that goes to both the question, Nancy, you were asking about, what's the benefit and how do you do these kinds of things, to learn this and to deepen my own sort of spirituality through someone else's without co-opting it, without, doing it in any kind of bad way, but in a very good way to do this. I think that's really crucial. And I think that practice, there was that question in the chat about the itikaf, this notion of literally, I mean, like I said, it literally means to sort of stay in place, but to seclude yourself, what would it mean to spend, a day and a night or 2 days or 3 days just simply in prayer and worship, which is no different for those of you who are Christian who understand or remember Paul's injunction, what would it be like to pray without ceasing? What is that like, and how do we do that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think one of the concerns was if there was obligation to work or whatever, how could you do this? And so in the military, you can take leave for that. I'm sure there's ways to take leave for that outside of the military as well. Once it's been identified that you have a serious moral injury type need, you can work something out with your leadership to take a day or two to do that outside of Ramadan, if it was going to help you. It's going to help you with this moral injury that you were trying to work on.
The other thing that I'm mindful of is that in the military, surely, as in the general culture, there's an increasing percentage of persons who do not identify with a particular religious tradition. And they'll find themselves in the military facing some unanticipated, or maybe they imagined it might happen, but they find themselves in a morally injurious situation, either by something they did that harmed another, or where they experienced harm. And they're most likely person to talk to about something like that. At least I realized that they could also go to, it's a different term in the different services, I think, but they might find themselves talking with a chaplain. And it occurs to me that Ibraheem, for example, you might be dealing with someone who doesn't identify with a particular tradition, but does have some sense that there's a larger power, a higher power, and certainly could have a deep sense of having failed who they intended to be. So a sense of shame or a need for forgiveness that isn't necessarily framed in that tradition, but the need is there for how to cope with this failure to be who they intended to be, or someone else failed to be whom they expected they would be toward them. How would you draw on Islam to be responding to that person?
Yeah. So there are several instances in the Quran where the leader or the pious one fell short, right, and needed to ask for forgiveness. And so I think it's important to realize that, again, you can do your best to try to stay on what we call the straight path, but at some point you're not going to be on that path, and you're going to need to ask for forgiveness and ask and to work your way back onto that path. And so um, just humanizing people's shortcomings is I think important to realize that, okay, you did your best, you fell short. God is going to understand that you're human and you're going to make mistakes, but the point is to acknowledge those mistakes, ask for forgiveness, and then get back on the path, and not to stay in this place of, oh, because I'm not perfect, therefore somehow I'm less than. No, we're all less than. We're working our way towards perfection, but it's a work in progress.
Mhm. And obviously, so you're drawing on the concepts that are central for your tradition regarding such a predicament, knowing that offering that, um, realizing that's not that they can, inviting them to reflect on those resources for their own, what is at that point a personal struggle, though they have come to a person that they know has a religious training or readiness to hear them, which is itself an interesting possibility.
I just put something in the
And
chat, just for people. Sorry, Raheem. I just put something in the chat because someone asked about moral injury, and just sorry, I apologize if you're not technically defining it. And I
No,
use
it's fine.
Jonathan Shea's definition,
Mhm.
which I think is really crucial because it's quite distinct from PTSD. In the sense of
Yes, it is.
what do you do and where does this happen?
Mhm.
But to the point about the practices, and Ibraheem's absolutely right. I often use the example, and Muslims will use this. Surah Al-Kahf, the 18th chapter of the Quran, has this story of Moses and this sort of figure that the tradition calls Khidr. And Moses, you have to understand, for Muslims, is the example of a prophet. Like the prophet Muhammad is a prophet like Moses. Like Moses is the sort of paradigm, the exemplar of what a prophet is supposed to be. And he completely messes up with this figure. Like, he encounters this figure who does amazing things. And Moses is basically, oh, can I hang out with you? And he's like, no, you're not going to be able to understand what I do. And Moses, I'm paraphrasing, of course, and Moses says, no, I can do this. And of course, three times Moses, and this is Moses, like like Moses makes mistakes. Forget about human beings. So I think that's one thing, like those resources. The other thing I think is that moment. And Nancy, you're absolutely right. If I look at my students, if I look at Americans in general, they're becoming increasingly less and less religious. Even here at this Catholic university, only about 40% of our students identify as Catholic. And so what are the resources there that aren't sort of religious ones? I think it's the deeper kinds of things. And so I mentioned Morgan Freeman, Mr. Freeman. Mr. Freeman owns a blues club, a Ground Zero in Clarksdale, Mississippi. If you ask me what's the religious experience for Morgan Freeman, I'll say it's sitting in the club listening to the blues and the music. Where I'm going with this is like so much of I have to be conscious because what I do as an academic is so much here. It's the academic, intellectual thing. But of course, we don't live here. We live here in our bodies. And so one of the things I love as a Muslim is, and I talked about this, the physical act, getting up out of your chair, going to the sink, washing yourself, spreading out the mat, reminding yourself that you're in this body. But then the music that oftentimes that creates, soothing and healing and both I mean, like the visceral stuff of the music, like what the music does to you, but also the singing, the lyrics, the kinds of things there. And that becomes this really interesting kind of thing. Like for how many of my students is going to this thing? Like I had a student just talk to me the other day about going to see Brandy Carl at the Hollywood Bowl and being really excited because for the encore, Brandy's been working with My Great Hero for years, Joni Mitchell, and bringing Joni out, and then bringing Annie Lennox out, and so there's Annie Lennox and Joni Mitchell and Brandy Carlisle singing Joni Mitchell songs. I'm like, man, I wish I was there, because that would have been this amazing like soul experience that has nothing to do with my being a Muslim and physically kneeling and praying, but it's understanding that God's creation includes Joni Mitchell, who is a Canadian, is our greatest songwriter. But no, so very different kinds of ways of helping to understand and deal with these things. So sometimes it may well be, go off and listen to some music, or better yet, go listen to live music. Go involve yourself with the performance and the musicians and the crowd, and feel that. Again, that goes, I think, to the collective, that, when you're feeling isolated, what's one of the best things to do? Go to a concert,
Well, that
Yeah,
might well
and
be.
real quick, Amir,
Please, go ahead.
you had mentioned Moses, and he started by fleeing because he had killed someone, right? And so just bringing those things up to people, and to say he became a great prophet, but his whole beginning was escaping from the land because he had killed someone. It was an accident, but he still took a life.
I think too that if a person came to you, Ibraheem, who did not identify with your tradition or any of the several Abrahamic traditions, and described a sense of shame or a sense of betrayal by someone else, the kinds of things that might well prompt someone to see a chaplain, you're able to reflect on the ritual resources of these traditions, and at least invite sometimes persons find this sort of practice helpful and if you see what I mean, you can draw on your storehouse of practices that address that kind of sense of betrayal, or I've betrayed my own self in the way that I behaved, and identify it as, coming from one tradition or another, and simply offering it. I could imagine that could also be of use, even for a person that wasn't familiar or a practitioner of your faith.
Yes, that is true. And the sense of belonging is one of my educational theories. Is one of the most important things that human beings need to have fulfilled. And
Right.
so, a lot of what was said by Amir and yourself, Nancy, touches on that to make people feel belonged, and even though you're not necessarily seeing, practicing the same faith, but you are a part of us. That's a very healing expression
so.
of care
Yeah.
for someone else.
Right, and that repair is possible. Repair with a higher power, however they define that, if they have such an idea, or with another. Well, you've enriched us a lot, and I'm very grateful for the expertise and your responsiveness to the questions. But we have come to the end of the hour for our conversation, and I want to thank those of you who have been communicating in the chat and sharing good questions and ideas for us to talk about, and remind you that these resources will be available within 10 days on our website and on the website of the Shea Center, so that you can watch this again or draw from it. So thank you very much, Amir and Ibraheem, and all of you who have been a part of this webinar.